An article in the press this morning about Axel Rudekabana's taxi driver brought something to focus, which I've been thinking about for some time. But really, I think it's time we were fairly clear about what's going on. Apparently, the taxi driver, 57-year-old Mr. Poland, hung around the scene for several minutes, did nothing, and then drove away. Now, on the face of it, that is, if not an immoral act, pretty close to it, and very disappointing. But there's something behind it. I suspect that he was aware that in modern Britain, modern UK, that if you call the police and there's someone involved who is of a protected characteristic, doing something even grotesquely terrible, the first person they are likely to arrest is not the perpetrator of any crime, but an innocent bystander or someone who called the police in the first place who did not have a protected characteristic. In other words, a member of legacy society, in this case, or someone deemed to be a member of legacy society. And the colour of skin apparently is largely a determining factor. Such is the grossly primitive attitude which is now dominating the UK establishment. It's shocking. It harks back to mid-20th century Germany, where they used to measure people's skulls to determine if they were considered acceptable to society and protection under the law and all the other goodies that go with citizenship, or should. It made my blood run cold to hear this particular bit of news. But someone should be driven to such fear to run away rather than call the police is very telling that something very, very wrong is going on. Anyway, in the meanwhile, the powers that be, Starmer and so on and so forth, talk about the rule of law, as if somehow lawless people are not obeying the law. And so I looked up the rule of law because I was a little bit ignorant about what it was really all about. And I'll just cover a few factors here. I've whipped them off the internet, but you'll get an idea. The basic principle of rule of law is that everyone should be equal when it comes to the application of law, and more so the justice system of justice applied to that individual or event, regardless of their power, social status, and so on and so forth. No one should be above the law. It seems pretty sensible. The second feature is there needs to be transparency and legal certainty, which again seems pretty obvious. You need to see the cogs going round and need to know who is doing what and why and so on and so forth. The third one is to keep the government away from influencing the system of the application of the rule of law. This implies a separation of powers, so the government is held at arm's length, and he doesn't start adjusting the law at its own convenience because the law isn't doing what the government wants it to do. That's critical. I'll talk about it a bit more later. Our next one, of course, is accessibility and the impartiality of justice. That seems pretty sensible. You don't want judges just, making judgments based more on their own biases, prejudices, greed, lust, whatever, instead of looking at the law itself and seeing how it applies to a particular situation, then acting accordingly. And it seems common sense for accessibility If it costs an immense sum of money to get a lawyer and all the other bits and pieces necessary to fight your case, and you don't have the money, well then you're in a bit of a spot, but you'll be likely to be crushed. In the UK, we spend vast sums of money paying for lawyers for some new arrivals who are obviously the most nasty pieces of work, and many other people, doubtless good people, benefit from that arrangement. So I'm not against it. I think it's very, very sensible. So it's the basis of the rule of law. The rule of law is not expecting people to go around being ruled by the book attitudes and their whole lives, political, social and everything else. Is it legal or isn't it legal? And if it isn't legal, regardless how stupid the law can be, in effect, when it is in contempt of itself, they'll blindly obey, because that's the law. I had a South African friend some years ago, fresh back from South. I say back, they'd lived there 2 generations, their family, so fresh from South Africa. And we were in a car park on a Sunday, just parking up temporarily to get a newspaper. The car park was laid out with little arrows and one-way systems and so on. And there were no cars in the car park. So when we got back in the car, I jumped in and drove straight across diagonally, ignoring all the arrows, across the empty parking spaces to the exit. And she was horrified, because you didn't go down the little arrows, follow the one-way system. Well, it was been stupid. There was no one around, there were no cars around, went straight across. Because that world of South Africa was more dictatorial, very much rule-bound, and blind obedience to the law was quite important, apparently. Nowadays, you can still get done for things in the United Kingdom which seem rather silly, like going across a mini roundabout rather than strictly going around it with your car. I admit to being guilty of that once or twice, but I can see the reason why. But because essentially mini roundabouts about giving more capacity to a junction, so it tends to help the flow of traffic. I was born, I can just remember days when you didn't even have give-way signs on roads. It was halt at major road ahead, and you had to stop in dozens of times, whereas nowadays they give you a little sort of sliding slip road onto the main road very often. You can sort of get a bit of speed and join the traffic without having to stop. So you have these give-way signs. Very sensible. And quite sophisticated rule book people who don't understand that life is not all stop, go, obey, disobey with no nuance. Anyway, back to Ruda Kapana, the mass killer. And that's what he was. I think what's happening here is that the legal system in the United Kingdom has had to disintegrate. This is rather weird, but if you try and work out what the law is in effect, rather than what it should be, then you get a better picture of how the disintegration of society into separate societies in one nation is being managed by the UK government. And this applies to the previous Tory regime and to the Blair regime, where it started to disintegrate. And what's happening is that when the police arrive at the scene, they judge, first of all, whether or not there are 2 societies involved. Now, if there are, almost by definition, a society is determined by whether it has its own set of laws. And if it does, then obviously, if you're the enforcement authority, you've got to be sensitive to that and apply different laws to different people. You can see where I'm going here. The rule of law is coming apart at the seams. Well, it isn't in a way, because you've got two sets of laws, two, as it were, sets of rules of law. And the police are in a very invidious position, because they know that if they take the side of an unprotected characteristic person, this in the case of the taxi driver, Rudy Cabana's taxi driver, if he were to become involved, he would most likely be implicated and have the cuffs put on him. The worse the situation, the more likely that is, because the greater the peril the police feel, the danger of taking, as it were, the wrong side. So, for instance, in the case of Edward Novak, the police knew, they know only too clearly, given the systemic injustice of politicians, had they immediately assumed or done their job properly to check out the facts before slapping the cuffs on a dying man, they could well be in trouble, because he is not protected, whereas the actual miscreants, the culprits, because his family were involved, were by definition protected. And that means protected from responsibility. It's a pretty ugly situation. So, if you spend a bit of time and analyse what's going on, you will be able to work out the two de facto parallel systems of law to suit two separate societies. And this situation has evolved from multiculturalism, because what underpins society, and society is in the intersubjective too, is culture. And culture is really very important to make compromise practical. The rule of compromise applies, and that is the felt cost of compromise must always be less than the cost of non-cooperation. That's critical, because if you have nil cooperation from people, the police have to become military. It's the only way to force people to obey. In a recent case in Birmingham, where a lad was being assaulted by three protected characteristics, the police came on the scene. He was admittedly drunk out of his skull, but he could still stand up and talk to people. They cuffed him and took him away. The three assailants just walked off. You can see the message they're getting, which is very, very clear. They are protected. And the police are protecting themselves, because if they were to try and arrest the three assailants, they know that their careers will be maligned instantly, because the three policemen against the collective outrage of the tribe of the protecting their own, fully understandable when they do that, even though it's not right, would mean that the police would have to have sacrificial lambs, and they would suspend them and most likely accuse them of racism, and then they'll be dismissed. Their careers ruined, the reputation smeared, and the establishment would roll on with its two-tier justice. Strictly speaking, it's not two-tier. It's actually two separate justice systems and two separate de facto legal systems, which have been ministered by a fatally compromised police force, because logically there should be two police forces too, and two systems of courts, and in the end, what you're dealing with is two separate nations, full-blooded, sovereign, independent entities. This is the logical conclusion of an unfettered multicultural system. Now, there's nothing wrong in accommodating different cultures. Nothing wrong at all. As long as the people understand, everyone understands, that there must be a mutual or an active acceptance that certain features of necessary for cooperation must apply to all. Otherwise you have a multi-society, and that is ungovernable by definition. So what we're seeing here is politicians effectively destroying democracy, because the only way they can get cooperation from people who see themselves as separate societies is to run a parallel justice system. That's in effect different laws for different people and different systems of justice and enforcement and sanction for different people, different groups of people. And so they're trying to hold on to the idea, the myth, that the United Kingdom is one nation. It is disintegrating. And it's disintegrating deliberately, because politicians are systematically destroying society in the vain hope that they can reduce all those misled and foolish members of legacy society to abandon their loyalty and belief in what they think is the source of all their troubles. People who do not want civic nationalism, they're sort of nativist people who are grit in the machine, people who deny that we are not all essentially tabula rasa and free of culture. Politicians don't understand society, and they don't understand culture, and this is a nub problem. And so consequently the law of compromise is almost incomprehensible to them. Society and culture accommodate contradiction and disagreement. So, of course, having a political system that's just controlled by society would be chaotic and impossible. Ditto culture. But there is a system, it's called democracy, which engages with society, and democracy can make sense out of it, because the democracy understands contradiction and works on the principle of compromise. Now you can see where I'm going. The issue simply is this. We have de facto two justice systems, two sets of laws, and the police force is expected to be, in effect, two or more police forces working on behalf of 1, 2, 3 or 4, however many societies that will not integrate or have not been obliged to integrate to the bare minimum necessary for a national government run in a democratic way. So what's the solution, you may ask? Well, it's awful to say this, but in the short term we may be forced into authoritarianism, and that makes my blood run cold. But a longer term solution is to take the academics to task, because they have shamefully, this is appalling, they've shamefully neglected to investigate democracy and how it works. The nature of society and culture and their contradictory elements, and the fact they don't have agency but less influence, they don't talk about that sort of thing because they can't really accept what is the fundamental of reason. And that's supposed to be big on reason. It's the third paradox of reason, that you have to accord at least temporary meaning and the status of truth to contradiction. You have to rescue the law of non-contradiction from itself. That's beyond them. And it's a very serious mental block. Unless we overcome that, and fairly quickly, then the academic world will continue to undermine the foundations of civilization and society with their closed system political theories, self-justifying, which are crucifying reason and destroying our future. I feel for that taxi driver. I really do. Because people are now terrified of being engaged with the police in any way, because they see what happens. And they think, yeah, it's terrible what's going on, maybe someone being knifed or beaten up by 3 or 4 people unjustly, whatever. But they think, well, if I join in, all it'll do is give them cover, and I'm going to be carried away in a Black Maria or what have you to the police station to face appalling allegations, injustice, because the police are trying to protect themselves. You can't blame them for that. What's going on isn't the fault of the police. They're doing what they can. Yeah, I mean, a lot of them are hopelessly inadequate. They're recruiting lightweight, and lightly built, small people to be police. It's a disaster. When you're dealing with a bunch of thugs, you need physical presence. There's no, alternative to that. We're not in a happy, clappy, rainbow world, and politicians think it ought to be, so they're trying to force ought onto is. Now, of course, we want to aim for ought all the time, but it's foolish to try and assume attitudes and beliefs that belong to a hopelessly inadequate and irresponsible fantasy utopia. We need to work towards and accept that we're going from something grotesque towards something better, and to assume that just being nice to people is going to make them nice. That's a disaster. On the other hand, assuming people are going to be horrid and be horrid to them just because you think they're horrid is equally stupid. So they call judgment that needs using, but people aren't allowed to use judgment anymore. It's part of the problem. So yeah, I really feel for that taxi driver because the way he acted, it shows exactly how far we have fallen, and the fault is squarely with the academics and the politicians who seem to be blindly following their lead. Many of them have been inculcated at university with these closed system theories and ideological beliefs. The idea of a democratic system is beyond them. Most of them, I suspect, hold democracy in deepest contempt, and they only respect it as far as it has been a pathway to their ability to legislate. Nothing more than that. And as is typically the case, once such people get into sufficient control, the first thing they do is to pull up the ladder and destroy democracy. That's the way it goes. Well, we're some way from that yet, but times are dangerous. The rule of law, when a politician starts spouting off about the rule of law, you will see hypocrisy incarnate. It's really that ugly. So don't go with the taxi driver. He's a victim. Yes, I know. He really is a victim. And those who claim to be victims, which number quite a few MPs, proud of their bogus or slightly twisted views of their past in many cases, they're the ones who are the problem. And we're partly responsible for voting them in. Anyway, there we go. Rule of law, when a politician starts shouting about that, in most cases, what you're looking at or hearing is a hypocrite, but a really dangerous hypocrite, because they're actually hypocritical about a point which they're trying to force down other people's throat. I don't mind hypocrisy in other aspects. If someone will know little, or in the early years, maybe in the 20s or something, was hypocritical at one subject, and yet later on they become a politician in an entirely different area. They're trying to suggest something, and then small-minded people say, "Oh, you hypocrite, you hypocrite." I won't have that. That's using the allegation of hypocrisy as an excuse not to listen. It's actually a very nasty trick. And as we're all prone to hypocrisy to a greater or lesser extent, the people who yell hypocrite are, reflexively, hypocrites themselves. They're condemned by their own words. So, interesting times. They will get better. And there are many commentators now that are coming out and using a similar approach to mine, maybe a lot more effective, professional, pushing that point. Let's see how things develop. Bye for now.